Daniel Hayes got up at 6 a.m. Daniel was up with the lark as usual. He stretched, feeling the satisfying pull of muscles across his broad shoulders. The smell of coffee wafted up from the kitchen. Sophie was already up. He patted his pockets, following the aroma. Sophie stood at the counter, her auburn hair messy from sleep, clutching a steaming mug. She smiled as he came in, looking handsome in the morning. "Morning, handsome," she said, sliding a mug towards him. Daniel grinned, wrapping an arm around her waist and planting a kiss on her forehead. "Morning, beautiful, sleep well." Sophie nodded, but her eyes darted away quickly. Daniel frowned slightly, but brushed it off. She was probably just tired. "Big day today," he said. "Johnson's accounts should be a nice boost to our bottom line," said Daniel, sipping his coffee. Sophie hummed in response, her attention on her phone. Daniel cleared his throat. "Don't forget dinner tonight, anniversary and all that," he said with a wink. Sophie looked up, her green eyes widening slightly. "Oh right, of course, how could I forget?" "Could I forget?" She laughed, but it sounded forced to Daniel's ears. He studied her for a moment. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Shaking his head, he drained his mug and headed upstairs to shower. As the hot water cascaded over him, Daniel's mind wandered. He thought about his father, the stern ex. He was a military man who drilled the importance of discipline and hard work into him from a young age. Those lessons had served him well, propelling him to the top of his field as a financial analyst. He thought about Sophie, her free-spirited nature a stark contrast to his own upbringing. Her parents had been globe-trotters, never staying in one place too long. It had taken time for Sophie to adjust to the stability Daniel craved, but he'd thought they'd found a happy medium. Lately, though, something felt different. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was pulling away and becoming more distant. He pushed the thought aside. They were happy. He'd dressed in his sharpest suit. Daniel headed downstairs. Sophie was nowhere to be seen. Probably in her home office, working on a design project. He called out a goodbye, hearing a muffled response from upstairs. The day flew by in a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. By 4 p.m., Daniel was wrapping up, eager to get home and surprise Sophie. He'd made reservations at her favorite restaurant, a cozy Italian place downtown. As he pulled into their driveway, Daniel frowned. An unfamiliar car was parked next to his usual spot. It was a blue sedan with out-of-state plates. Probably one of Sophie's clients, he reasoned. But he had a nagging doubt. He went into the house quietly, not wanting to disturb Sophie if she was in a meeting. The silence was oppressive and heavy with an unseen tension. Daniel's heart began to race, though he couldn't say why. As he climbed the stairs, he heard muffled sounds coming from their bedroom. His palms grew sweaty as he approached the door. He took a deep breath and pushed it open. The scene before him seared itself into his memory. Sophie was tangled in their sheets with Clara, Daniel's sister. Time seemed to stop. Sophie's eyes met his, a flash of guilt quickly replaced by something else. Was that a triumph? Clara scrambled to cover herself. Her face was a mask of shock and fear. "What the hell is this?" Daniel's voice was low and dangerous. Sophie sat up, not Daniel cut her off, his mind racing, piecing together 1,000 little moments that suddenly made sense. The distant looks, the hush, phone calls, the way Clara always seemed to be around lately. Clara found her voice. "Brother, please, we can explain." Daniel laughed a harsh, bitter sound. "Explain? There's nothing to explain. I see it all perfectly." Daniel pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. "I just sent your husband a video of you. Isn't it funny how technology works?" The color drained from Clara's face. "You know what?" she stammered. "I wouldn't, you wouldn't. What do you think you're doing?" "Daniel," she said, scrambling out of bed and hastily pulling on her clothes. "Your clothes. You'll regret this, Daniel. I swear to God you'll regret this." Daniel stood his ground, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Clara, you'll regret this. Both of you will." Sophie finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. "Daniel, please. We could talk about this. Talk. Daniel's laugh was hollow. There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice now. Clara finished dressing, her eyes wild with panic. I have to go, she said to Lucas. Oh God, Lucas, she added as she rushed past Daniel. He grabbed her arm and demanded how long she'd been there. Clara wrenched away and spat at him. Then she fled down the stairs. Daniel turned back to Sophie, who sat frozen on the bed. She was the woman he loved and trusted, and he wanted to build a life with her, but she was suddenly a stranger. I want you, he said. By morning, he said, his voice cold. I don't care where you go. Just get out of my house without waiting for a response. Daniel turned and walked out. He made it to his car before the first tears fell hot and angry down his cheeks. As he drove away, his mind was already turning to thoughts of revenge. Revenge. Daniel knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Daniel slammed the car door shut and gripped the steering wheel, his hands shaking. He was still reeling from the events of the past hour, each replay stoking the fire of his anger. He drove aimlessly, not ready to face the emptiness of a hotel room or the pitying looks of friends as the sun dipped below the horizon. He found himself outside Jake's bar, the neon sign flickering in the growing darkness. The sign flickered like a beacon in the growing darkness. He parked and walked in, the familiar smell of stale beer and whiskey washing over him. Jake looked up from behind the bar. His easy smile faded as he took in Daniel's haggard appearance. Jesus, man, you look like hell, Jake said. Daniel slumped onto a bar stool. Feel like it too, he replied. Jake poured another drink. Daniel downed it in one gulp, relishing the burn. He met Jake's concerned gaze. Sophie and Clara. Jake's eyebrows shot up. Daniel nodded, his jaw clenching. He'd caught them together. Jake breathed out. He poured another drink. How long? Daniel didn't know. He didn't care. He growled. It's over. Jake leaned in. His voice was low. What are you going to do? Did Daniel's eyes harden as he listened to Jake's account of what happened? Daniel poured out the whole sordid tale, offering refills and the occasional curse as the bar emptied. When the sign flipped to closed, Jake joined Daniel at a corner table. You need a plan, he said, his usually laid-back demeanor replaced by fierce loyalty. I can't let them get away with this, Daniel nodded. A grim smile played at his lips. I've got ideas, but I need more. I need to know everything over the next few days. Daniel threw himself into his investigation. He called in sick to work, using the time to dig through emails, text messages, and anything else he could access. Each discovery was a fresh wound, revealing the depth of Sophie and Clara's betrayal. On the third day, he showed up at Daniel's temporary apartment with coffee and bagels. Daniel answered the door unshaven and a bit out of it. You look like you could use a coffee, Jake said, pushing past him into the living room. He surveyed the chaos of papers and laptops. Daniel grabbed a coffee and took a long sip. It's worse than I thought. He showed Jake the text he'd uncovered, messages spanning months of evidence that showed not just an affair but a calculated effort to undermine him. Jake's eyes widened as he read. Jesus, they've been playing you this whole time. Daniel nodded. They've been manipulating me, making me think I was the problem. He clenched his fist. Well, now they're going to learn what a real problem looks like. Jake looked up, concern etched on his face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time to take control of the narrative, Daniel said with a dangerous glint in his eye. They want to paint me as the fool. Let's see how they like being exposed over the next week. Daniel meticulously gathered evidence and compiled emails, texts, and photos into a damning dossier. He reached out to Avery, a local journalist known for her hard-hitting journalism. Avery met Daniel at a quiet cafe. She looked him up and down, taking in every detail. This is quite a story, Mr. Hayes, she said, flipping through the file. Are you sure you want to go public with this? Daniel leaned forward. His voice was steady. Absolutely, he said. They don't get to hide in the shadows anymore. Avery studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. she said. I'll need to check a few things, but if it all looks good, we can run the story next week. Avery left, and Daniel felt a surge of satisfaction. The wheels were in motion, but he wasn't done yet. That evening, he crafted carefully worded emails to Sophie's clients, hinting at her unprofessional behavior and suggesting they might want to review their contracts. He sent a more direct message to Lucas, attaching photo evidence of the affair. Sophie called, her voice shrill with panic. What the hell are you doing? My clients are pulling out left and right. Daniel's voice was cold. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth. Sophie, isn't that what you want? No more secrets. You're ruining everything, she cried. No, Daniel. You did that when you decided to screw my sister. He hung up, blocking her number. Clara was next. Her message was filled with threats and pleas. She pleaded with Lucas, threatening to take the kids. You can't do this to me, Daniel. His laugh was bitter. I'm not doing anything to you, Clara. This is all you're doing. You made your bed, now lie in it. The final piece of his plan fell into place when he received an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue. Perfect, he thought. Time for the grand finale. The day of the barbecue dawned bright and clear. Daniel arrived early, a projector and screen hidden in his car. He set up. As the neighbors arrived, Sophie and Clara showed up together. Their faces were tight with worry. Daniel approached them and said, "So glad you could make it." He smiled, but it was a bit sharp. "I was hoping we could all talk and clear the air." Sophie's eyes darted around nervously. "Daniel, please not here." "Oh, but this is the perfect place," Daniel replied. "After all, everyone here is practically family." As the crowd gathered, they were drawn by. There was a palpable tension in the air as Daniel stepped up to the makeshift stage. He cleared his throat and said, "If I could have everyone's attention, please." He hit play on the projector, and the screen lit up with images and texts laid out in damning detail. The crowd gasped and murmured as the extent of Sophie and Clara's betrayal became clear. Lucas pushed through the crowd, his face red with fury. He yelled at Clara, "You lying bitch!" Clara stumbled back. Her face was white. "I can explain," she said. "There's nothing to explain," he replied. "It's all right." Sophie collapsed onto a nearby chair, sobbing. The neighbors stared, some in shock, others with barely concealed glee at the unfolding drama. Daniel stood tall, his voice carrying over the chaos. "I thought everyone should know the truth," he said. "No more lies. No more manipulation." As the crowd buzzed with shocked conversations, Daniel felt a weight lift. Jake appeared at his side, clapping him on the back. It was intense. Daniel nodded, watching as Sophie and Clara tried to flee the judgmental stares of their neighbors. "It's dawn," he said. "They can't hurt me anymore." As the sun set on the disastrous barbecue, Daniel walked away, head held high. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, he felt free. The chains of betrayal had been broken. Daniel was broken, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The days following the barbecue passed in a blur for him. He threw himself into work, finding solace in the predictability of numbers and spreadsheets. But even as he tried to move forward, the aftermath of his actions rippled through his life. One evening, as Daniel was leaving the office, his phone buzzed with a text from Clara. He hesitated, then answered. "What do you want, Clara?" His voice was cold. Daniel's voice was cold as he replied, "I don't want to talk to you, Clara. I've messed up. I know I've made a mistake, but you're my brother, and I've always loved you. Please, just give me a chance to explain." For a moment, Daniel felt a flicker of the old affection he had for his sister, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her betrayal. "I love you, Daniel," she replied, her voice clouded with emotion. He laughed. "If you call that love," he added, "I want you to know that you made your choice, Clara. Now live with it." He hung up, his hand shaking slightly as he drove home. Daniel's mind raced. Had he gone too far? He shook his head, but the doubt lingered. They deserved everything they got. The next day, Daniel was at his desk when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Hayes, there's someone here to see you," she said. "It's urgent." Daniel looked up, surprised to see Lucas, Clara's ex. Daniel's husband was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Lucas," Daniel said, rising from his chair. "What can I do for you?" Lucas strode into the office and slammed the door behind him. "You can explain what the hell you think you're doing," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing. "I thought I was doing you a favor. Don't you think you deserve to know the truth?" "The truth," Lucas spat. "That's what you want to know. You've messed up our lives. CLA is a mess. The kids are confused and upset. Why? Because of your petty revenge. Daniel, you're making me angry. You think you're in the right, but you're just petty. You betrayed me. You betrayed my wife and my sister. How would you have handled it?" "I would have handled it like a man. Not like a child throwing a tantrum." "Daniel, get out of my office." "Now or what?" Lucas challenged. "You'll expose me too." "Go ahead. I've got nothing left to lose thanks to you." The tension in the room was palpable for a moment. Daniel thought Lucas might take a swing at him, but then the fight seemed to drain out of the other man. "You know what, you're not worth it," Lucas said, his voice heavy with disgust. "You think you've won? Look around, Daniel. You're alone. Congratulations." As Lucas stormed out, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. He sank back into his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of everything he'd done that evening. Daniel found himself back at Jake's bar, where it was busier than usual, with the weekend crowd in full swing. Jake spotted him and waved him over to a quiet corner of the bar. "How are you holding up, man?" Jake asked, sliding a whiskey across the bar. I shrugged and took a long sip. "I don't know, Jake. I thought I'd feel better by now." Daniel thought about what Jake had said. He decided not to waste his time being angry. There was a commotion at the other end of the bar. A group of people had just walked in, laughing and talking loudly. Daniel's heart sank as he recognized Sophie among them. Their eyes met across the crowded room for a moment. Everything else faded away. Sophie's smile faltered. It was replaced by a look of shock and regret. She started to move towards him, but one of her friends grabbed her arm and steered her towards the table. Daniel turned back to Jake. He could see that Jake understood, and nodded. Daniel knew he needed to get out of there. He needed to go home and get some rest. Things would look better in the morning. But as Daniel drove home, he knew sleep would be elusive. He was still thinking about the confrontation with Lucas, Jake's advice, and seeing Sophie. It all swirled in his mind, a tornado of emotions. The next few weeks passed in a haze. Daniel threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, impressing his bosses and earning a promotion to team lead. But the victory fell hollow on a sunny Saturday as Daniel was leaving the gym and quite literally ran into someone coming around the corner. "Oh, I'm so sorry," a feminine voice exclaimed. Daniel looked up, ready to brush off the apology, when he found himself staring into a pair of warm brown eyes. The woman was about his age, with curly dark hair and an easy smile. "No harm done," Daniel said, managing a small smile of his own. "I wasn't watching where I was going." The woman laughed, a sound that inexplicably lifted Daniel's spirits. "Well, in that case, maybe we're both to blame," she said. "I'm Ella," Daniel replied, shaking her offered hand. "Nice to meet you, Lila." They chatted for a few minutes, discovering they both worked in the same office complex downtown. As they parted ways, Daniel felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Over the next few weeks, Daniel ran into Lila several times. Each encounter left him feeling lighter, more like his old self. They grabbed coffee and talked about their work and hobbies. One evening, after dinner, they walked through a nearby park. Lila turned to Daniel and said, "Daniel, can I ask you something?" He nodded, curious. Lila hesitated, then asked, "What happened to you? I can tell there's something you're carrying. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. But I'm here if you need to talk." Daniel was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he took a deep breath and told her everything: the betrayal, the revenge, the aftermath. When he finished, Lila was quiet. Daniel braced himself for judgment, for her to walk away, but instead she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for trusting me with that," she said softly. "I can't imagine how much that." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He thought he was doing the right thing by exposing them, but now he wasn't so sure. Lila squeezed his hand. "You were hurt and angry. It's understandable, but Daniel, you can't let that anger define you. You're so much more than what they did to you." As they continued walking, Daniel felt as if a weight was lifting from his shoulders for the first time in months. After months of pain and anger, Daniel could finally see a future beyond his situation. The next day, he sat in his office, gazing at the Denver skyline. The city seemed full of possibilities. He thought about everything that had happened, from betrayal to revenge, and the consequences. He made a decision. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. After a few rings, Clara answered. Her voice was cautious. "Daniel, Clara," he said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Okay, clarify. When and where did they agree to meet?" They decided on a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. As Daniel hung up, he felt a mix of emotions. He was apprehensive and angry, but he also felt something else. It wasn't forgiveness, but maybe understanding. The next day, Daniel arrived at the coffee shop early. And chose a table in the corner, away from prying eyes. When Clara walked in, she looked tired and older somehow. She said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Daniel nodded, studying his sister's face. "I'm not here to forgive you," he said. "I don't know if I ever can, but I'm tired of carrying the burden." Daniel could see that Clara was angry and upset. He knew he had hurt her more than he could ever make up for. He had been selfish and stupid, and he had lost everything because of it. He wanted to know why. He had been thinking about it for months. "Why did you do it?" Clara was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She wished she had a good answer for him. She was lonely. "Invisible in my own life, Sophie, she made me feel seen, but that's no excuse. What we did was wrong, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Clara asked, her voice hinting at hope. Daniel said slowly that he was willing to try and move forward, not as we were before, but something new. "If you're willing to put in the work," Clara nodded eagerly, tears streaming down her face. Daniel replied, "Absolutely, whatever it takes." As they continued to talk, Daniel felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. It'll be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. Weeks turned into months. Daniel threw himself into his new role at work, earning respect and admiration from his team. His relationship with Lila deepened, built on a foundation of trust and mutual understanding. One evening, as they sat on Daniel's balcony watching the sun set over the mountains, she turned to him and said, "You seem different lately." Lila observed that Daniel seemed more at peace. Daniel smiled and took her hand in his. "I feel different," he said. "I've realized that holding on to anger was only hurting me. I'm not saying I've forgotten or completely forgiven," he continued, "but I'm ready to focus on the future, our future." Lila's eyes sparkled as she leaned in to kiss him. He knew he'd made the right choice. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy him had instead led him to this moment, to a love built on honesty and trust. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Daniel looked out at the city below. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain, the anger, the growth, and he realized that while trust once a relationship has been broken, it can never be fully restored. But new trust can be built, stronger and more resilient. Daniel squeezed Lila's hand, feeling grateful for the woman beside him and the life they were building together. The future was full of promise and possibility. Daniel Hayes had been betrayed, but he was ready to embrace the future with open arms.